Alright, so I am briefly going to go over circulatory pathways here, and we'll wrap up this video talking about fetal development of blood vessels and fetal circulation, because most of these circulatory pathways we are going to be covering primarily in lab, and so I don't want to take too much time here in the lecture for them. But I do want to touch on them briefly. So the circulatory system, really important, obviously, for getting oxygen and nutrients out to all the cells and tissues in our body and picking up all of the waste products and stuff. But in addition to that kind of stuff, our cardiovascular system, our blood is also going to deliver hormones to various parts of the body. It's going to have clotting factors in it, platelets to seal off any wounds. We've got white blood cells to help fight infection, repair damage, and all sorts of stuff. Our circulatory system is also going to help regulate our body temperature. Again, that blood reservoir. We are going to integrate with the lymphatic system. We'll talk about that later in the semester. And then it's going to help make sure those blood or muscle cells stay healthy. Really important for our nervous system because our cerebrospinal fluid is going to actually come from our bloodstream. And then reproductive system is obviously going to be hormone regulation as well as erection of genitalia for both sexes. With the respiratory system, that's where we're doing that gas exchange. It's going to provide a lot of nutrients and stuff to bones, in addition to hormones and stuff like that, and bring out all of those blood cells that are developing in the skeletal system. And then it's also really important to integrate with the urinary system because our kidneys are going to be doing so much of the filtering in our body. They are really important. So we will look at all of these different systems as we keep going throughout the semester, and how blood flow goes through those. Again, our pulmonary circuit is heart to lungs and back, and so we have these pulmonary capillaries that are going to surround something called alveoli in the lungs. This is where gas exchange happens. We'll talk more about alveoli when we do the respiratory system. But in this particular case, this is where it's really important to remember that arteries carry blood away from the heart and veins carry blood back into the heart. Because, like I said in the heart videos, generally speaking, we use the color red to represent oxygenated blood and blue to represent deoxygenated blood. That does not automatically mean that every red vessel is an artery and every blue vessel is a vein, because in the pulmonary circuit that is reversed. So in this case, these up here in blue are the pulmonary arteries. They are carrying blood away from the heart out to the lungs. And then down here in red we have the pulmonary veins, which are bringing blood back into the heart from the lungs. All right, so that's really important to keep in mind, especially as we get into lab material. All right, so we have a lot of major systemic arteries and veins. We will cover some of these in lab in the following week of class, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but this section of your chapter can potentially be really helpful as an aid to learning all of these vessels, as well as the actual blood flow through these vessels, because you will be asked to know that as well as part of lab material, is knowing how that blood flows through the body, through these arteries, through the veins. And again, you really want to remember that arteries take blood away from the heart, veins take it back to the heart. You're going to get sick of hearing me say that, but I do it every semester and people still forget it, so I'm going to say it a lot. And I apologize to those of you who already have that tucked away and know that, but really important. And so charts like this in the textbook can be really helpful in learning that blood flow pattern. Some people find these helpful, some people find them really confusing. I personally think they're kind of confusing. They make a little bit of sense, but they seem really confusing to me. But if they're helpful to you, then absolutely use them. All right, same idea here with these flow charts of the blood flow through the body. So like we would come from the abdominal aorta to the left common iliac artery and the right common iliac artery, and then from there we have the right external iliac and right internal iliac. So that's just that blood flow again. All right. So lots of branches off of the aorta. We will cover these with the heart, and we'll do all of the other vessels with the actual vessel topics. All right, but we've got these really nice images and blood flow things throughout the textbook to help with all of that information. And again, now we're looking at some blue vessels, and because these are systemic vessels, not pulmonary vessels, these are going to be carrying deoxygenated blood back into the heart. All right, so lots of veins. There you'll see when we get into lab, there are generally going to be a lot more veins in any given area of the body than there are arteries. All right, so these kinds of flow charts for the veins, again, veins are going back to the heart. So to trace this blood flow, this is one of the reasons I don't particularly like these charts, is I think these should have been done the other way, with all of this information down here, starting at the top and then following it back to the right atria. But just remember, we are going back to the heart. Hepatic portal system is one section of arteries and veins that we will learn in lab. It can be kind of difficult, but I'll give you some tips and tricks and stuff for remembering that. But this is all basically blood flow from the digestive system into the liver. And then the liver will dump that blood back into the inferior vena cava before it goes back to the heart. All right, so we are going to wrap up with fetal circulation and development of blood vessels. So like we talked about in our last series, in our last chapter, the heart is developed by around the 3-week mark, 3 to 4-ish week time period is when we're getting that very, very primitive heart formed. By about week 4, all of these circulation patterns are pretty well established, and we are going to still need to be slowly growing a lot of these blood vessels and everything as the fetus continues to develop. But obviously this is a really important system to develop early on in fetal development. So blood vessels are going to start forming around 15 to 16 days post-fertilization, and then the rest of the heart comes in a couple days later. And so during the first few weeks of development, blood vessels form from embryonic mesoderm layer, just like the heart does. The precursor cells are hemangioblasts. They are going to turn into angioblasts, which will then develop into blood vessels and pluripotent stem cells, which can become the different elements of blood. So everything with our cardiovascular system, from the actual physical structures to the blood cells themselves, come from that mesoderm layer. All right, so these cells are going to form blood islands scattered kind of throughout the embryo, which is not pictured here, and those are going to later become those blood development sites. And then some of the blood islands will turn into vessels, and start forming those lumens. They'll kind of start opening up to form those lumens. So what we end up with fetal circulation is a lot of these just kind of general vascular tubes. They're not quite fully into arteries or veins specifically just yet, because we are still at this point attached to the umbilical cord and placenta. And so we have that blood supply coming in that way, rather than it being formed from our own body and putting those cells into circulation that way. So we are going to have these umbilical arteries and umbilical veins that are pictured right in here. These will disappear after birth, after that umbilical cord is cut, and we no longer need those. So we have the umbilical vein is going to carry oxygen-rich blood from the mother to the fetus. And then we have umbilical arteries that are going to carry oxygen-depleted blood from the fetus out to the placenta. And so again, arteries carry blood away from the heart, veins carry blood back into the heart, which is why the umbilical vein is carrying blood, oxygenated blood full of nutrients into the heart, and the umbilical veins are carrying deoxygenated blood away from the fetus. All right. These umbilical arteries are going to remain in the adult as something called a medial umbilical ligament. So instead of staying as arteries or veins, they actually turn into ligaments, which is really interesting, I think. Super cool that our body can kind of do that conversion process. All right. So we're not going to get into a lot of this in the heart. We already talked a bit about the ductus arteriosus and foramen ovale and everything. But there is some circulation that we want to talk about here. So we'll focus on that circulation rather than the structure specifically. So we have three major shunts. Shunt is an alternative pathway for blood flow found in a fetus in that circulatory system. Two of these three shunts are going to take blood from the pulmonary to the systemic circuit, and the third is going to connect the umbilical vein to the inferior vena cava. All right, so these first two shunts are absolutely critical during fetal development because the lungs are very, very compressed and filled with amniotic fluid, so they're fully non-functional, and so gas exchange is done through the placenta rather than the lungs. So those shunts will close shortly after birth once the newborn starts to breathe on its own, gets that amniotic fluid out of the lungs and stuff like that. That third shunt will stay around a little bit longer after birth, but does become non-functional once the umbilical cord is severed. And so our three shunts are the foramen ovale, ductus arteriosus, and ductus venosus. So the foramen ovale up here, again, that opening between the two atria, this is going to allow blood to flow from the right atria to the left atria. There is a valve associated with this opening that's going to block backflow of blood, and this is going to kind of allow some of this oxygenated blood into the left atria, which will then go to the left ventricle and get pumped out through this rudimentary aorta that we have here. Once the newborn starts to breathe all on its own after birth and blood pressure in the atria starts to increase, this shunt, that valve, is going to close, or at least it should close, and then kind of seal itself up. This is a common congenital heart defect, but pretty easily repaired. The ductus arteriosus, right over here, this is going to be one of our rudimentary vessels that's going to connect the pulmonary trunk to the aorta. So in an adult, those two are not connected at all, but they are in a fetus. So most of the blood that gets pumped from the right ventricle into the pulmonary trunk then gets diverted into the aorta. And again, that pulmonary trunk would usually take blood to the lungs, but because in the fetus we are getting that gas exchange done through the placenta, we are having to get that fresh oxygenated blood from the placenta. And so that'll come through that umbilical vein, and then up into the inferior vena cava, which is going to then connect into that right atria and then right ventricle. All right, so that's why we need it to go through that pulmonary trunk. Once the newborn starts breathing, the pressure in the lungs is going to drop a lot because we're getting that amniotic fluid out, and that is going to cause the lungs and the pulmonary vessels to expand, and that's going to force the ductus arteriosus to constrict and actually seal off that passageway completely. Or again, at least that's how it's supposed to happen. And then the ductus venosus, which is located down here in this area, close to the liver. This is a very temporary blood vessel that branches off of the umbilical vein. that is going to take some of that freshly oxygenated blood coming out of the placenta and is going to bypass the liver of the fetus and go directly into the heart. So this ends up getting replaced later on by the hepatic portal system and the other arteries in the digestive region and the liver. The ductus venosus is going to close slowly over the first few weeks of infancy and actually degenerates to become another ligament around the liver. And that wraps up our material for week 8 with the cardiovascular system.